If you're into videos about supernatural phenomena, unsolved mysteries, and true crime, you've come to the right channel. We upload new videos 2 to 3 times a week, so if this sounds like the content you enjoy, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on all notifications so you never miss any of our weekly uploads. Now, let's dive into the video. Mike Wooley had been hunting in the woods of northern Louisiana for years. The dense forest was like a second home to him. He knew every trail, every bend in the river, and every secret spot where game liked to gather. It was late November in 1981, and the air was crisp with the kind of stillness that only deep woods could offer. The silence, though peaceful to some, always had an underlying tension, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every snap of a twig or rustle in the leaves. Mike had been out since dawn, hunting deer near an old logging road, far from any signs of civilization. The forest seemed even quieter than usual that day, with no birds singing, no rustling leaves, not even the wind seemed to move. As a seasoned hunter, Mike had learned to trust his instincts, and today they were sending him uneasy signals. But he brushed it off. He was alone, miles from his truck, and that's exactly how he liked it. Out here, he didn't have to deal with people. Out here, it was just him, his rifle, and the woods. He'd been sitting in a tree stand for hours when he first noticed something strange. A sudden stillness, more than just the typical calm before an animal crossed your path. It was a dead quiet, as if the forest itself had taken a breath and was holding it. Mike peered through the brush, eyes scanning for movement. Something was off. The deer he had been tracking had stopped its movement completely. It was as if every creature around him had vanished or gone into hiding. And then he heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees, unlike anything he had ever heard before. It was deep, primal, like a predator claiming its territory, but much larger than any mountain lion or bear he'd ever encountered. His heart started to beat faster as he tried to rationalize the sound. But it wasn't right. The growl was followed by a series of sharp, almost animalistic screams, sending a cold wave of fear washing over him. He clutched his rifle tightly, every hair on his body standing on end. Then came the movement. Off to his left, just out of his direct line of sight, he saw something moving through the trees, large and quick. His pulse quickened as he shifted to get a better view, though part of him didn't want to. The figure darted through the underbrush at a speed that no man could manage, and it was tall, much taller than any human or known animal. Mike strained his eyes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was massive, covered in dark hair, and moving with a purpose that suggested it wasn't afraid of being seen. Suddenly, the figure stopped. It stood there, partially obscured by the trees, just watching him. Mike froze. He had the distinct feeling that whatever this thing was, it was aware of him. Worse, it was sizing him up. Then it did something that made Mike's blood run cold. It let out a scream. The sound ripped through the air, a high-pitched wail that seemed to vibrate the very trees around him. Mike flinched, but he didn't move. He didn't dare. The creature stepped out of the brush. It was easily over 7 feet tall, maybe more. Broad-shouldered and covered in thick, matted hair. Mike's breath caught in his throat as he saw its face, human-like but wild, with deep-set eyes that gleamed with intelligence. Its mouth curled back in a snarl, revealing teeth that looked far too large for any animal native to these woods. Mike's grip tightened around his rifle. He had the weapon pointed directly at the creature, but he wasn't sure if he should fire. It hadn't moved closer yet, but he knew that if it decided to charge, he'd only have seconds to react. Then, from behind him, came another growl. Mike's stomach dropped as he realized there was more than one. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of a second creature moving through the trees behind him. This one was just as large, if not larger. Panic surged through him. 2 of them. He was surrounded. The first one, still standing in front of him, began to move again, slowly, deliberately, as if testing his reaction. Mike's mind raced. He couldn't outrun them, not on foot. They were too fast, too strong. His truck was nearly a mile away, through thick woods. Firing his rifle might provoke them, but not firing might mean they would close in. Every instinct screamed at him to get out of there. Then it happened. The creature in front of him let out another ear-splitting scream and began to shake a nearby tree with a strength that seemed impossible. The entire trunk swayed as it pulled and pushed at the branches, snapping them like twigs. Mike's breath came in short, sharp bursts. He had to move. Now. Without thinking, Mike bolted from the tree stand, crashing through the underbrush as fast as he could. His boots pounded the earth, adrenaline kicking in as the terror fully set in. He could hear them following him, their heavy footsteps crashing through the forest behind him. He dared not look back. The trees seemed to blur as he sprinted, branches tearing at his clothes, his lungs burning with each frantic breath. Behind him, one of the creatures let out a roar, deafening and primal. Mike's legs ached, but he pushed harder, heart pounding in his chest as he made a beeline for his truck. His mind raced as he dodged fallen logs and thick roots, hoping he could make it out of the forest alive. Then came the sound he'd been dreading. A tree crashed to the ground behind him. They were throwing things. He could hear the thud of heavy branches hitting the ground, getting closer. Mike didn't stop, even when one of the trees slammed into the dirt just feet from where he had been seconds earlier. He could feel the creatures closing in, hear their guttural growls growing louder, more aggressive. His truck was in sight. He saw the glint of metal through the trees and pushed himself harder. His legs were shaking now, and his lungs felt like they were on fire. But he didn't slow down. Another tree crashed down just to his right, sending dirt and leaves flying. They were toying with him, hurting him. Mike could feel it. They were intelligent, and they wanted him to know they could catch him whenever they wanted. Finally, he broke through the last of the trees and stumbled toward his truck. His hands shook violently as he fumbled for the keys in his pocket. He could hear the creatures behind him, just beyond the tree line. He didn't dare turn around. The moment the door unlocked, Mike threw himself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind him. For a brief second, he sat there in stunned silence, his body trembling from the adrenaline. Then, a heavy thud rocked the side of his truck. The creatures were still there, just out of sight. He turned the key in the ignition with shaking hands, and the engine roared to life. Without waiting another second, Mike slammed his foot on the gas and sped down the old logging road, leaving the woods and whatever had been chasing him behind. It wasn't until he was miles away, on a paved road with the forest far in the distance, that he allowed himself to breathe again. His hands were still gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of those massive creatures sprinting after his truck, but the road behind him was empty. Mike never went back to that part of the woods again. The encounter haunted him for years, and every time he thought about it, a shiver ran down his spine. He didn't know what those creatures were, and he didn't care to find out. Whatever they were not just animals. They were something far more intelligent and far more dangerous. Even now, after all these years, the memory of those creatures watching him, chasing him, hurling trees in their path, still gave Mike nightmares. He had always loved the peace and solitude of the forest, but that day it had shown him a side of itself that was anything but peaceful. That day, Mike had come face to face with something ancient, something primal, something that wasn't supposed to exist. But it did, and Mike Wooley would never forget it.